It's been like 2 months since my Twilight video, but I'm back with about the same amount of research. But this one isn't as fun. In 2009, after the release of Uncharted 2, Sony Computer Entertainment, headed by Naughty Dog, started developing this new game about this girl who's born into a world that was torn apart by a fungal outbreak. They released the game for PlayStation in 2013 to great success under the title The Last of Us. In March of 2020, just at the best time of our lives, I would say, they announced that they were going to start production on an HBO series based on The Last of Us. And on January 29th, 2023, HBO just dropped this gem of an episode into our laps called Long, Long Time. And I cried about it for 2 days. You can't give us Nick Offerman being a sweet old gay man without making us cry forever, basically. The thing about this series is that, yes, it got review bombed by homophobes, but also there's this conversation of like film bros on TikTok where they're saying, I don't get the hype about this episode, it's not that sad. They actually lived a whole life, it's not sad, I don't get why people are crying over it. Which is, like, I have a stunted emotional development, but not that bad. So instead of being a healthy person and going, not interested, I ended up getting very interested and typing up this whole thing, which took me 2 months. The thing about the episode and the thing about the discourse that really caught my eye and drove me into this research rabbit hole was the conversation about the radio and how the radio was used as a code. In episode 3, it was revealed that Bill and Frank were the ones sending codes to Tess and Joel in episode 1. And we know from episode 1 what the code was, right? 60s, nothing new, 70s, there's something coming, and 80s mean trouble. Although this code was revealed in episode 1 and a lot of people know based on the games that this was Bill and Frank, there's a motorcycle outside, but it was only revealed in episode 3 that this was Frank's idea. And this broke me, because Frank said, 80s mean trouble, obviously. To many people, this may seem like just a throwaway line, like, okay, whatever, 80s mean trouble, satanic panic maybe, but to a lot in the LGBTQ community, this was very obvious. Frank, a gay man who, based on episode 3, seemed to have a lot more experience than Bill, probably would have lived through the 80s AIDS epidemic in the US. And living through that means that he would have lost a lot of friends, a lot of chosen family, and probably lived in a world where you could just die. And no one was really giving a shit. This was an era where gay and bisexual men and trans women, especially those of color, were just left to die by the government. And the showrunners using the 80s sort of throwaway line as a reminder that these two would have lived through this outbreak and then them surviving this newer outbreak really spoke to a lot in the community. The showrunners wanted to show a story where the people won in the zombie apocalypse, where they don't want to use zombie, but they're zombies, let's be real. But they wanted to show a story where the people won, which in an apocalyptic situation usually just means survival. But survival isn't living. So this episode was an episode where they didn't just live, but they thrived, and they loved, and they lived a full life. And the fact that they chose this episode to showcase an old gay couple, especially men, reminded me a lot of the art made by the queer community in the late 70s to 90s. This was supposed to be a zombie show, like fun zombie show from a video game, and then I thought about this, and then I spent 2 months researching things, and it made me so sad that I have to share it because misery loves company and I don't have any. Side note, just quick tangent before we get sad. Remember this? Dr. Ratna from episode 2? She's played by Christine Hakim, and I've met her. Here's a picture of us. And yeah, we met during a film competition thing that I entered, and she was one of the judges, which means that I've effectively made her watch my absolute dogshit movie. And that's something to be proud of. In this video, I'm going to talk about the use of zombie as a literary device. I'm going to talk about the AIDS epidemic of the primarily 80s and 90s, and I will talk about queer art and queer joy. As with the Twilight video, all of the sources will be linked in the Google Docs below, and thank you for watching. Grab some tissues. It's gonna be sad. First of all, yes, I'm going to call them zombies. I know they're clickers and they're bloaters and whatever. They're fungi instead of like a thing, a virus, whatever. But they're zombies, and it's much easier to examine them as zombies than this like complete separate entity, because it's not. Let's be real. All of the zombie movies are like, it's not about zombies. Yes, it is. Also, just first of all, they are based on cordyceps that are called zombies. Like the ants that get infected with cordyceps, they are referred to commonly as zombies, so I'm gonna call them zombies, okay? If the scientists agree with me, I don't care what the showrunner said. Unlike most sort of gothic monsters that are popular in media, especially modern media, the zombie doesn't actually originate from Europe, which if you saw my Twilight video, you know that vampires and werewolves are all very European. Zombies, however, are uniquely this combination of Afro-American culture, and by American I mean the continent, and it has its roots in Haiti and in the faith of Fudan. Fudan itself represents the history of Haiti, with roots in, I'm gonna read this, Yoruba, Fon, and Congo traditions brought over during the slave trade mixed with French influences. And when Haiti was fighting for independence from the French, a lot of voodooists were involved, and thus there was a link created between voodoo and revolutions. Zombies, spelled without an E, in Haitian tradition was someone that was sort of put to sleep or killed, and then brought back to life by a bokor or a sorcerer. And a lot of the times this was someone who was ostracized from the community, being othered. And the punishment for being the sort of other in the community was being turned into a zombie who didn't have any agency anymore and typically lives as a slave to the bokor or sorcerer. Before the abolition of slavery in Haiti, slave owners would use this fear of zombies or being turned into zombies as a control tactic, where they would say, if you're good in this life, you'll die and then you'll be free. But if you're bad, you'll continue being a slave for the rest of forever. However, this taps into a fear that is very different from the way zombies are used in modern literature and modern media, where the fear is now usually about being part of an unthinking group instead of being the one person who becomes unthinking. There's this distinct cultural difference between Haiti and sort of Western culture, where there's an emphasis on community in a lot of non-Western culture, but in Western Europe and especially in the US, there's a big emphasis on individuality. And if your biggest fear is losing that individuality, the horde of zombies becomes a lot more terrifying than being a singular zombie. In American literature, the evolution of the zombie myth also coincides with what problems the country was facing at the time. So zombie literature usually rise in popularity along the same time that there's a crisis. So during the Depression era, the zombies were slow and unthinking and sort of the Shaun of the Dead type zombies. And then George A. Romero zombies are more hungry zombies, and those are associated with the Cold War. very fast and like charging zombies are associated with the AIDS epidemic, and more modern zombies are biological warfare sort of outbreaks, and that coincides with, I think, around 9/11, where it's more of a you're fearing an attack from someone else. Romero zombies, however, are the core of the American myth, and by America I mean the US. Pre-George A. Romero movies, zombies are strongly tied to the Fudan culture, to Haiti, and to sort of this idea of it being an exotic thing. However, from Romero's work, and as we can see now in more modern zombies, it is very tied to a representation of American consumerism, where, yes, there's other cannibals in American literature, for example, Hannibal Lecter, who's classy and like very weirdly human about it, but zombies aren't. Zombies are unthinking and they just consume and consume and consume without really being mindful about it and rampaging everything in its way. It's more of a craving rather than a want or a need. It's more like you don't need it, you don't want it, it's just you're drawn to it without really thinking. The thing about the zombie myth now is that it's very tied to America, to the US, instead of to West African culture, Central African culture, or Haitian or Caribbean culture at all. Now it's mostly a US thing. And this is because the tie to American consumerism is so strong, especially post 9/11, because we think of America as consumers, and it's like a very easy thing to think that it's like a just Americans want things more, right? You look at there's no other country that holds a sporting event, and the thing you're excited about is not the sport but the commercials. You don't watch the World Cup for the commercials or the show in between the two halves of the game. Like, you just watch it because it's a football game. But what's interesting about America is the uptick in American consumerism coincides with post 9/11 era Bush policies. And this was because at the time a lot of businesses were failing because people were very afraid to do anything. Especially, you would be so afraid to go on a plane. But one of the things that Bush encouraged post 9/11 was for people to pack up their families and go to Orlando, Florida, and go to Disneyland to boost the economy, boost sort of the stocks of airlines, and make sure that they're afloat by going to Disneyland, which is the most American thing you could ever America. Consumerism became a way that the American government cements Americans' US identity, especially during the Cold War. How do you differentiate between your side and the other side when the other side is communists? You consume more. You go full ultra capitalist. As said by Robert Reich, US former labor secretary, the terrorists tried to strike at the heart of American capitalism. We show that American capitalism is alive and well by giving it as much of our credit card as possible. As zombies have this insatiable hunger for human flesh, consumers in a consumer society have this insatiable need for new things to consume. And as Jen Webb and Sam Bernard put it, capitalist competition is visible in its roughest, rawest form in depictions of the average zombie, who spends all of his or her energies in struggling to gain more and more. The perfect consumer, the perfect exemplar of the search for personal advance through self-interest. The Last of Us actually, I think, addressed this in further episodes where they had a literal commune, and they literally said, we live in a commune, we're communists, and with a Texan man just confused as fuck, which was mwah. But I didn't end up watching episode 4 forwards. I just watched 1, 2, 3 because 3 got me so sad I didn't want to watch the rest of it until I was mentally okay, and I haven't recovered from Fleabag yet. So Another allegorical role that zombies play is this idea of turning something you know to become something so foreign from you that they will attack you. Zombies can turn your neighbor, your family, your friends, anyone on your sight. They turn them not to be just like an other, but as an other that wants your flesh, wants you dead. And this became a big thing in zombie literature during the Cold War, during the height of McCarthyism, which says like your neighbor might be a Soviet spy, you know? And this part of the zombie myth really creates chaos in the world. Unlike ghosts or werewolves or vampires, zombies always create chaos, always create an apocalyptic situation because it's part of it. When something that you know very, very well becomes something that you can't place in your life, becomes something that you can't recognize, it really fucks up your life. And if you want to make that kind of story, you need to fuck up the world as much as possible. And this is why zombie literature is so popular during crisis times, because it's such a good caricature for your enemy. Whatever it is, it's something that can attack you and wants to attack you, but you can overpower it quite easily. They also unthinkingly move in groups. They're dumber than you, they're weaker than you, and they are infecting others, which during McCarthyism, it's like, be careful, the Soviets are turning your children into communists, which now it's like you just replace the other group with another group, and then, here's the anti-trans propaganda now. Time is a flat circle, everyone. There's also this fantasy in zombie literature that flattens the societal hierarchy. There really isn't like rich or poor people, especially in a zombie situation like The Last of Us, where it's based on literally how much you consume, whether or not you get infected. It really flattens this idea of rich and poor, or people in power, people not in power. It becomes everyone's at risk. We know that in reality, that's not usually what happens because, again, look around. But, one can dream, and the place to dream is literature. As Bakhtin put it in Rabelais and His World, in the world of carnival, all hierarchies are cancelled. All castes and ages are equal. And the authority of the official realm of church and state is suspended. With all its norms and values, the world is permitted to emerge from its routine. A long, long time is a great representation for how the flattening of sort of government and the church and every sort of structure of power can be this fantasy that people write into zombie fiction. Because Bill and Frank seem to live in Massachusetts, right? And the outbreak happened in September of 2003. The thing is, gay marriage wasn't legalized in Massachusetts until 2004, which means that when they did get married at the end of Frank's life, it was their own decision, even when the government wouldn't have let them do it. When there's no government, who's gonna tell you no? Who's gonna tell you your marriage isn't legal when no marriage is legally recognized, because there's no one to recognize it? However, in the context of Long Long Time, there is another layer as to why this episode was so important and so poignant. Zombies have been inextricably linked with infections for a very long time, because it's a very easy way to show infections, right? This thing that looks dead bites you, you also become dead. Simple. Zombies have also been a representation of something that devastate communities. And for a very long time, and by a very long time I mean also in the Bible, the devastation of communities and societies have long been linked with divine retribution. My personal theory is that humans are inherently good in that we want things to be fair, and it's much easier to see devastation and sort of connected with our own sense of wanting everything to be fair if you think that they deserve it. because it's much easier to justify injustices than fight for justice. Which brings us to the US AIDS crisis. Bill and Frank in the show met in 2007, with Bill being in his 40s and Frank being a little bit younger than him, meaning that they not only lived through, but probably grew up during the AIDS epidemic. Now in 2007, in a world where AIDS is definitely not non-fatal, they were faced with another outbreak. And this time, this one isn't blamed on them. And I think that's the thing that touched a lot of people about this episode. The showrunners took a very small role in the game. Frank was not even voiced. Frank was just mentioned, right? And they took this very small role and they made them into one of, if not the best romance in television in modern history. One where gay men grew old and loved and thrived and happy and never losing each other in a devastating pandemic. A story that I know a lot of people wish they had. There's this thing where people say like, oh, a long time ago there weren't gay people. There aren't old gay people. And the thing is, with a lot of gay men and trans women, they were left to die. Frankly, they were left to die from the late 70s to, I think it was 1995. And they didn't just die, they had their entire histories erased a lot of the times because it was such a shame that their partnerships were erased and their entire lives were just swept under the rug, and their families pretended that they never existed or they were never gay and they died of something else. Even Liberace, I think, when he died, his doctor said he died of something completely different. And this points to the line that Frank said to Bill, I like you older, older means we're still here, which to a lot of gay and bisexual men isn't the truth. Bill, being in his 40s, probably grew up sort of in his teen years in a post-Stonewall America, which means that he lived through probably the late 60s and 70s in this wave of, hippie culture and this wave of love and advancements in gay rights, and then the 80s hit. In 1981, the CDC first reported 5 otherwise healthy gay men in the West Coast, I think in LA, dying from a rare lung infection. At the same time, otherwise healthy young gay men were developing Kaposi sarcoma, a type of skin cancer, in California and New York. By the end of the next year, it had killed over 1,000 people. What we now know as HIV/AIDS did not have a name at this point. It was new in that there was no outbreak, but it had been discovered since I think the 60s. However, the public health sector and the LGBTQ community knew that there was something and that it was affecting gay and bisexual men more than anyone else. And LGBTQ communities in a post-Stonewall era have sort of created their own communities within society, where they help each other get information about, at the time, pre-AIDS was about hepatitis B, and they help a lot of young LGBT individuals who came out to a non-supporting family and had to find somewhere else to live, and there were many grassroots organizations fighting for gay rights, civil rights, in racial equality, in gender equality, in abortion rights, essentially in every sort of leftist idea. So what was good about it was that they already had communities that could just shift from warning people about hepatitis to warning people about AIDS, sort of helping them understand more about safe sex and about the dangers of IV drug injections, and hey, there's this new disease spreading, be careful. The bad thing was that this was the only way that people could get help for a long time. This was because the government was completely silent about AIDS for a very long time. In fact, Ronald Reagan, who first took office in January of 1981, didn't say the word AIDS until 1985, until his next term as president. He finally mentioned it in September of 1985 after a close friend of his died from AIDS, when the total number of people who have been killed by AIDS in the US alone have surpassed 10,000. Now, do you see why Bill thinks that the government are all Nazis? Especially when we consider who AIDS affect the most: people of color, gay and bisexual men, trans women, and drug users. But especially in the beginning, in fact, it was so associated with gay and bisexual men that the New York Times called it GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. And Kaposi sarcoma was referred to commonly as the gay cancer. As the AIDS epidemic progressed, it highlighted this rift between different parts of society. To this day, African Americans still disproportionately die and catch AIDS. And Africans globally are infected with HIV and die from AIDS so much more than everyone else by a fucking mile and a half. While in this video I'm going to focus on how AIDS affected gay communities, especially gay men, because this is a stupid video about The Last of Us, please don't forget, I would be remiss if I don't mention how people of color and trans people, especially trans women, are so disproportionately affected by HIV and AIDS even to this day. One of the flaws that we have in the way we teach history is how we segment different parts of history. We segment, Cold War, like space race, Vietnam War, Korean War, they're all different things, when in reality they're one and the same, they happen around the same time, causes were the same, right? Or we sort of segment, for example, the Nazis killed Jewish people, which is 100% true. That's not the only group that the Nazis targeted. The Nazis also targeted Romani people, disabled people, gay people, and trans people, and they target gay and trans people so much, they burned all of the books in a university that researched gender identity and sexuality. But also, the hatred and genocide towards Jewish people didn't start and end with the Nazis at all. It has been going on for a very, very long time. But I'm talking about this because it's all connected. It's all connected in how we perceive history. We often think about the AIDS epidemic as being a homophobia problem, which in a large part it is, but it's not the only problem. It's also a race problem, it's a class problem, and it's a problem of funding. This was the era of reaganomics, and part of Reagan's plan was to slash the budget for the NIH, the CDC. Sounds familiar yet? When federal funding for AIDS was passed, 2 years and 600 bodies later, it had to be in the same bill as research for toxic shock syndrome for it to even be passed. From 1984 to 1985, what little funding for AIDS prevention, only 4% was used in outreach to educate about methods of prevention. 4%. It was also a purity culture issue and a homophobia issue, obviously. But this all happened during Reagan's administration, a very conservative administration. And the people who are predisposed to AIDS and who are dying from AIDS are the people that don't fit into the conservatives' ideal of US, the conservatives' ideal of an American family. For a lot of conservatives, lawmakers, and conservatives who were in positions of power, this meant that these were people who were collateral damage, were dying from divine retribution, were people who should be allowed to die. Richard Buchanan, Reagan's communications director, said in 1984 that homosexuals have declared war against nature, and now nature is exacting an awful retribution. Reagan himself said on the campaign trail that he doesn't condone homosexual lifestyles, and thus the Helms Amendment was born. In 1988, legislation was passed to mandate that any outreach program for HIV to not indirectly or directly condone homosexual sexual activities, which meant that the most important things in prevention could not be discussed. Safe sex could not be discussed because it would be discussing sex between men. It was also mandated that at least 1/3 of the funding for HIV prevention to go to an abstinence-only approach, which we know has never worked and will never work. On top of this, again in 1988, the US outlawed any needle-changing programs. On top of this, again in 1988, the US outlawed any needle exchange programs, which meant that IV drug users could not get clean needles, which increased the likelihood of them getting AIDS. But if they were drug users, they don't fit into this idea of the perfect America, so they were left to die. They were legislated to die. Legislations were passed knowing that if there were needle exchange programs, it could significantly reduce the risk of HIV, AIDS, and other infections, as had been at the time seen in other countries, but they didn't fit into this ideal, so they were left to die. These exchange programs were not only done sort of in, the more liberal countries like the Netherlands or whatever. This was also done in the UK, which at the time was under Maggie Thatcher. Do you know how hated Margaret Thatcher is? Do you know how much you have to fuck up? Even beat Margaret Thatcher in your fuck-ups? The big difference politically between the US and the UK, which were both under a conservative government at the time, was that the UK was more fiscally and financially conservative than socially, in comparison to the US. Had been, since then till now, socially more conservative as well. And partly that's because American politics has a lot to do with a cult of personality more than the party itself, because there's only two. You can't pick, do you want to eat dog shit or cat shit? It's all shit. You don't want either of them. So you gravitate towards the people. That's not great because people are not institutions. They don't affect change as much as you would like. Reagan's voter base was fiscally, financially, and socially conservative, which meant that the government couldn't allocate enough money towards prevention or research in HIV and AIDS, but also it's very difficult for the government to come out in support of people who were dying from AIDS because these were not people who fit the ideal. Again, this gave Reagan a choice in 1985. Do you talk about your close personal friend who, like many Americans, are dying from the supposed gay plague, or do you keep your voter base? Representative Henry Waxman from Los Angeles stated, "It is surprising that the president could remain silent as 6,000 Americans died, that he could fail to acknowledge the epidemic's existence. Perhaps his staff felt he had to, since many of his new right supporters have raised money by campaigning against homosexuals." Mind you, discrimination isn't about, someone hurt my feelings, they said something bad about me. The problem with discrimination is that it runs very deep and it affects every part of your life. And during the AIDS epidemic, one of the worst things was that there was no protection against discrimination in the workplace, in that you can get fired if you had AIDS or you were found out to be gay. In other countries, that would just mean you were out of a job. But in the US of A, this also meant that you were out of insurance, so they could find out that you had a deadly disease, fire you because of it, and then you lose your insurance and you can't get treatment for it at all. And treatment at the time didn't mean that you could stay alive and, get cured from it. It was just management. It was keeping you okay as much as possible. Many at the time had to keep their identities and their diagnoses secret, not only because they feared discrimination, like someone saying mean things to you, people don't want to be friends with you, but because they could lose their health insurance. And many, if people knew about it, if their families knew about it, had their identities completely wiped clean because it was so much more about shame than grief. What this created was a need from not only the public health sector, but also from AIDS activists for the perfect victim. For a victim that they could put forward as the face of people with AIDS who middle America could not say no to. The problem with this was that this took away resources from people who were actually at risk, and it created more panic and fear, and people who are panicked and in fear are not going to make good decisions. However, this also shed light onto the perfect victims. White middle-class Americans who weren't gay, were abstinent, wasn't a drug user, and just sort of tripped and fell into this role of being the spokesperson because they were the only people who middle America would listen to. Someone who did everything right and still got it, like Ryan White. Ryan White was a teenage boy who got AIDS from a contaminated blood transfusion. He was for a time not allowed back in school because people, for some reason, still thought that AIDS could be spread from casual contact, which it can't. Ryan White tragically passed 5 years after his diagnosis, but at the time of his life, the 5 years that he had it, he broke stigmas and became a national figure for people who had AIDS. George A.W. Bush's AIDS policy was even named after him. Despite many LGBTQ plus communities and organizations that have been fighting for rights and protection for people with AIDS, it had to be someone who wasn't in the community, someone who conservatives could see as one of their own for anything to get done. And this is the problem with empathy and the perfect victim. In the wake of the Idaho murders, a lot of discourse happened on Twitter, a health site, but a lot of discourse happened about the person who survived the murders and how she didn't do enough. And a lot of discourse happened around the perfect victim, the idea of the perfect victim. As long as you survive, you could have done more. In sexual assault, the perfect victim is someone who didn't speak up. And in the case of AIDS, the perfect victim was someone who contracted AIDS even though they did everything right. And the problem with this is they are not in any at-risk group and they had a very slim chance of catching it anyways. The people most in peril from AIDS were not the groups of people that the conservatives wanted to keep alive anyways. These are people that the ideal middle-class suburbanite would not have had a conversation with. It would have been so easy to see the people who caught AIDS as someone completely other, a member of a completely separate society. And it would be very difficult to empathize with them because you don't know any of them. And when you can't empathize, you are not driven to help. Research has shown that there is a very strong tie between you being able to empathize with someone and you wanting to help them. And I feel like this research is like, it's kind of a no-brainer. Great, this is what we're supposed to do, right? However, if you've ever watched the news, you've probably experienced people suffering, telling the stories of them suffering, and then people just going womp womp. And that's where the research about empathy becomes fascinating. Also, this is also where my research made me want to cease to become human. I would like to be a crab now. If I tell you that there is a big correlation between race and empathy, you would probably go, yeah, obviously. You would also probably think, like I did, that it had something to do with someone of your own race being more likely to be someone you are related to. But no, the link is actually the opposite. The link has less to do with you being the same race as the other person and has a lot more to do with you being a different race from the other person. That's a very confusing way that I explained it, but this paper explored a study where they used different colored hands, and they showed people footage of these different colored hands getting stabbed with a needle, and they measured the electrical response of the skin of the person observing the hands. And as we expect, white people had more reaction when shown a white hand, and black people had more reaction when shown a black hand. Issue: when they were shown a violet hand, like a hand that was painted purple, they had more of a response towards the violet hand. There was more of a correlation between empathy and racial prejudice than an evolutionary connection, which means that our ability to empathize and our lack of capacity to empathize with people in a different group from us is not nature. It's how we're taught. This phenomenon have been researched time and time and time again, and it has been found not only in racial differences, but also political differences. And this does not only affect sort of everyday interactions or even lawmakers, this also affects the way people practice medicine, because black and brown people have historically been treated worse in medical situations, especially when it comes to pain management, because they are observed as being less in pain or more likely to abuse drugs or more likely to be lying for some reason. Also, procedures that are designed for people who are assigned female at birth are a lot of the times not performed under any anesthesia. For example, a cervical biopsy where you are taking part of your tissue and you're not given any pain management for it. Or any anesthesia for it. Also, the insertion of IUDs, you're not under local anesthesia a lot of the times. You're just given ibuprofen or paracetamol. For quite an invasive procedure, you're putting something quite far into your cell. And if you are a cis man and you are saying, if the doctor didn't give you pain meds for it, it's probably not that bad, please look up what a speculum looks like and decide if you want one part of your body to feel like the floor in a body shop and the other part of your body feel like the tire on a car and someone is just using a car jack to separate the two. Mind you that on top of this, a lot of the people who are affected with HIV and AIDS are people who are poor, unhoused. A lot of them were driven to prostitution to survive. A lot of them turned to drugs to cope with life. A lot of them are people of color. A lot of them really don't have money to spare to get private insurance or anything like that. If you want to know more about that experience, I would really recommend reading Close to the Knives by David Wojnarowicz. I'm going to talk about him more later on during the art section, but I'm just telling you now, that book gave me so many chills, and also I cried. It is a very difficult book to get through, both in terms of content and because it's very like stream of consciousness, so sometimes the sentences are 2-page long, but if you're watching this, I think you're used to that. There's also something called the collapse of compassion, where the people who need the most help are usually people who we can empathize with the least. Not only that, but the more people of that outgroup who are suffering, the less likely we are to empathize with them. In Batson's Elaine experiment, they found that given the opportunity to leave the situation altogether, people who empathize with a test subject who needed help were more likely to not leave and instead actually help the person. But if you didn't empathize with the person, the existence of an easy escape route made you way more likely to just leave the situation and not help. In Batson's Katie experiment, they found that the most likely scenario that you would empathize with someone was when you would imagine someone suffering under a relaxed condition, and the least likely would be when you were in an aroused state and you observe it happen. Now, being relaxed and not observing people suffering was just not an option in the 80s and 90s. On top of that, the media needed to collapse this illness with a foreign identity. As David Craig said in his analysis of Susan Sontag's body of work, for Sontag, in the context of AIDS, the use of the plague and pollutant metaphors signified the political weaponization of disease and the diseased, and particularly those afflicted by an illness of unknown origin that was infecting segments of society already deemed pariahs. None of this is new. This collapse of identity with a disease has a very long history, including, for example, the 1918 Spanish flu. It didn't come from Spain, and different countries had different names for it. There were countries that called it Spanish flu, German flu, Russian flu. In fact, this practice of collapsing a foreign identity with an illness is so common that the idea of an illness being the Chinese flu have happened 3 times in the past a little bit over 100 years. At this point, I've given up on the idea that history rhymes or history repeats itself. I think history is more like a Rage Against the Machine song, which just repeats the same 4 lines over and over again, and no one listens to them. Everyone's just like, oh, this is cool, and then just never internalize any of it. And this is the issue. We are so used to assigning problems that face all of us to a certain group of people and saying they are going to deal with it, that we let people die. To quote Kristen Lisa Davis's thesis on the gay gang murders in Bondi Beach, like other stigmatized groups, when they're classified as victims, gay men are unlikely to be constructed as innocent victims. This was exemplified in the initial public response to the AIDS epidemic in the United States, where gay men and/or injecting drug users, sex workers, Black Africans, and Haitians were cast as guilty and deserving victims in opposition to the so-called innocent victims, children, hemophiliacs, and people who contracted HIV through blood transfusion, and women who contracted HIV from their male partners. Such social constructions have been critiqued by a number of national and international theorists, who highlighted the way in which these dominant misconceptions actively influence the public, political, and biomedical responses to AIDS. But within the LGBTQ community, there was no way you could assign blame elsewhere. It was a problem for the community, and there was a wide range of responses, from rage to sadness to grief to frustration to numbness, and there is no better way to express that than art.
Love will abide.
You may have heard the phrase, history was written by the winners, and it is true for the most part, especially if we're talking about history books. But the most interesting parts and the most poignant parts of history are not written in history books. They're written in diaries, they are in paintings and knitting work, and in stories passed through generations, in fashion and language, in the way people do their hair. You don't find them in history textbooks. You find them in the change of patterns in how humans behave. And these accounts of people with boots on the ground are a lot more effective in telling you about history than a set of raw data or a timeline. There's a much bigger impact in reading, for example, the Diary of Anne Frank than reading a textbook about World War II. For this video, I read a bunch of papers, read a bunch of books, and I can tell you firsthand there's a big difference between reading papers about the 80s, about how many people died, about how the government left people to die, and reading an account like Close to the Knives. This book doesn't draw you into David Wojnarowicz's perspective. This book forces you into it and doesn't let you go. In the 80s, reporting for AIDS were made as minimal as possible. This was so bad that information about AIDS was only given by the government, by the CDC, because one doctor, Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was a staunch conservative, had enough of it, wrote up a report, sent it to every household in the United States. This was against any precedent. There were over 216 million copies that were sent. This was the only information that a lot of people get. Again, a reminder, this man was a staunch conservative. It still advocated for abstinence, but it did discuss safe sex. And that was too much. That was too much for the Reagan administration. That was too left. This got this man in a lot of shit, and he even said about the Reagan administration's stance at this time that it was transmission of AIDS was understood to be primarily in the homosexual population and in those who abuse IV drugs, and that people dying from AIDS were only getting what they justly deserve. However, the LGBT community is never one to sit tight and just wait it out. In metropolitan cities like New York, the art scene was very robust. People met and drew and painted and discussed, which is the most important. They discussed, and they commemorated a lot of people whose lives were erased, or people tried to erase them, like Stephen Arabino. Stephen Arabino was 32 when he passed from AIDS, mere months before the medication that could have saved his life became widely available. To a lot of his friends, he was the last of them to die. Stephen Arabino only gave his family a 3-day notice that he was dying from AIDS, and his family came to his apartment in Los Angeles, and when he died, cleared the apartment out, including a lot of his partner's stuff, until what was left was a single electric fan. And this electric fan was taken by Stephen Arabino's partner, John Boscovich, and was made into this piece, which is titled "Feel It Motherfucker," only an unclaimed item from Stephen Arabino's estate. It's the fan encased in plexiglass with holes cut out of it. When it's on display, it's constantly on, which means that no matter what, no matter if you don't want to look at it and you want to look sideways, you will feel the air as you walk past it. And I've heard it described as feeling like a dying breath as well. It's an angry and desperate reminder that people love, and no matter how much people try to erase them, they will be remembered by the people who matter to them most. There are many pieces of art from this time that were very angry, understandably, and a lot of them were made by David Wojnarowicz, who I've talked about before. Even if you don't recognize the name, you probably know something about him, because you probably recognize this picture. This is a picture of David Wojnarowicz's jacket that he wore to protests, and this idea of dumping your body in front of a government building inspired at least one person, so I will put the name here, who drove his boyfriend's ashes to the White House and dumped it on the lawn of the White House. He wore this jacket when he spoke at one of the many protests he went to, and I couldn't find the video of that particular protest, but I did find a video of the same speech. So I'm going to play some of it here, but I would really recommend for you to click on the link down below and watch the whole thing.
There's a thin line, a very thin line. As each T cell disappears from my body, it's replaced by 10 pounds of pressure, 10 pounds of rage, 10 pounds of pressure, 10 pounds of rage. And I focus that rage into nonviolent resistance, but the focus is starting to slip.
He also made a lot of collages and stencil art, and I'm going to show 3 of them today. But I really encourage you to go look at the rest, because he was fantastic. So first of all, let's just show you the one that made me cry for some reason. But this one is called Something from Sleep 3. And I cried about this probably in an abnormal amount. Something about space just makes me cry a lot. This one is probably his most famous painting. It's called Fuck You, Efsler Fucker. He titled this after a piece of paper with the insult and just the weirdest doodle I've ever seen in my entire goddamn life. And he actually used it in the painting in the bottom there. The last one I'm going to show you is this one, called Untitled in parentheses, Hujar dead. These shadowy pictures are pictures of Peter Hujar shortly after his death. He was David Wojnarowicz's mentor and at some point lover, and they had a very strong relationship all the way to his death. Even David Wojnarowicz's boyfriend said that this relationship was not romantic, it was something very, very particular and very, very strong. And these pictures of Peter Hujar is layered under the speech, the transcript of the speech that I just showed you. But other artists had very different approaches to this time in their lives. The art they made didn't seem angry, but rather numb or sad. One that I'm sure you've seen is Keith Haring's Unfinished Painting. You probably have seen Keith Haring's other paintings. I think some of his artwork is on like Uniqlo shirts. But also he did the Crack is Whack mural, and his art is generally very poppy. It's quite happy looking. And then at the end of his life, he made this. I don't think I need to explain this, and I don't think I can, so I'm just going to leave it with you for a few seconds. The last artist I'm going to show you is the artist that I have mentioned before in the intro to this video, Felix Gonzalez Torres. While Keith Haring's Unfinished Painting was about his own diagnosis, a lot of Felix Gonzalez Torres' work was about the diagnosis and death of his long-term partner, Ross Laycock. This piece, called A Portrait of Ross in LA, is just a pile of candy. In a corner of a room, it's just a pile of candy. It's a pile of candy that weighs exactly 76 kilograms, which was the weight that Ross Laycock was at the end of his life. And when you view this piece of art, you are encouraged to pick up a piece of candy or two and take it with you, to make you understand that you are part of the society that created this problem, that you are taking away literally from his body. And the Art Story Foundation put it as, you are being complicit in the disappearing process, akin to the years-long public health crisis of HIV/AIDS. Felix Gonzalez Torres himself said, "Without the public, these works are nothing. I ask the public to help me, to take responsibility, to become part of my work, to join in." I would really recommend you look up Felix Gonzalez Torres' other works, but also go to Art Story Foundation, especially on his page. He has a lot of good quotes on there. I'm not gonna read all of them because I'm very bad at reading out loud, but there are like a dozen quotes there and they're fantastic, and I really encourage you to go look at them. And the last artwork that I'm going to show you is the one that reminded me of The Last of Us. Have you forgotten that this video was about The Last of Us? But this artwork is called Perfect Lovers, and when Bill and Frank died in each other's arms, I immediately thought of the artwork is of two clocks that will run out of battery at different times or at the same time, but probably at different times. This piece of art was based on a doodle and a love letter that Felix Gonzalez Torres wrote to Ross Laycock, which reads, "Don't be afraid of the clocks. They are our time. The time has been so generous to us. We imprinted time with a sweet taste of victory. We conquered fate by meeting at a certain time in a certain space. We are a product of the time. Therefore we give back credit where it is due. Time. We are synchronized now, forever. I love you." And this is why Long Time is such an important and poignant piece of media. We don't see many older gay men, not in real life, but definitely not in media, especially not in media where they are happy and thriving and living their lives to the fullest. LGBTQ people have for a long time been only represented through queer-coded villains or people who die in gruesome or tragic ways. Or sometimes, like in Disney movies, they are barely there at all. And although Bill and Frank die at the end of the movie, this isn't a bury your gays trope because they lived such a fulfilling life. And even though they died at the end of the movie, they did so peacefully and lovingly in each other's arms. And unlike many gay and bisexual men, Bill and Frank, against all odds, grew old. They had a life despite the zombie apocalypse full of joy.
Love will abide.
Have you ever heard of the stereotype that LGBTQ people just walk faster than everyone else? There's also a stereotype, especially for lesbians, that they get together faster, and the culture of U-hauling, right? And there are phrases like gay time. Have you ever wondered why that is? Judith Haberstand put it this way: queer time is a perverse turn away from the narrative coherence of adolescence to early adulthood to marriage to reproduction to child rearing to retirement to death. Queer people often have to wait a longer period of time to come to their own and to present as who they truly feel, especially if you're trans. For some, especially older LGBTQ people, they might never have that opportunity to present truly as themselves. Then, when you get to live your life as you get presented with not only homophobia, transphobia, and all of that issue, you're also presented with the fact that LGBTQ people statistically live a shorter life than their cishet counterparts, especially black and brown gay and bisexual men and black and brown trans feminine people. This is for a whole bunch of reasons. Yes, there's the problem of AIDS, but since ARTs and PrEP, the risk of HIV becoming AIDS or becoming fatal has been reduced by a lot. But there's also a problem with LGBTQ people being more prone to depression and suicide, being more prone to getting killed, especially with a lot of countries and a lot of states in the US having a gay panic defense, which is a legal defense that says that you are in a state of panic and you claim self-defense because a gay person or a LGBTQ person was making advances towards you, which could mean anything. Have you seen how people are confused about when people are flirting or not? This has been used over and over again across the globe to not only drop charges but also reduce them from murder to manslaughter, or murder, like first degree murder to second degree murder. This also have been used for people, for mostly cishet men, who sleep with someone and then find out that they're trans. As recent as 2023, this was used successfully in New South Wales, Australia. There are 33 states in the US where this is still a legal defense, and the earliest ban for this, the earliest, was California in 2014. There are also a lot of countries, most recently Uganda, where being gay is punishable under death. In a lot of different ways, LGBTQ people are at a higher risk for death. Up to the 1990s, gay men had a life expectancy 20 to 30 years shorter than their cishet counterparts. Queer people literally don't have time to waste. They have to move fast in every aspect of their lives. In the way we live now, in the society we are in now, everyone in any sort of minority or oppressed group will experience this Foucaultian disciplinary power. You have a fear within yourself about stepping out of line or not being, the model minority or being sort of the acceptable version of whatever minority or oppressed group you're in. For a very long time, the only safe way to be queer is to not show it, whether through lavender marriages or having a beard or a frock, or through just never coming out and denying yourself from yourself, or through speaking in languages like Polari. For a very long time, queer culture, even in the most liberal cities in the United States, were done in the dark, were done underground. Cultures like ballroom culture, voguing, whacking, they were done outside of the view of mainstream society. And for example, with voguing, it didn't come to mainstream attention until Madonna did it. The problem is there's no happiness in fear, and there's no happiness in denying your own identity from yourself. For queer people in the United States, especially for people of color and trans people, the words in the Declaration of Independence have never been true. They have never given the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but not from a lack of trying. Like, for example, the San Francisco Gay Men Chorus, which started 44 years ago and have sparked LGBTQ choruses all over the United States and all over the globe. They also fund young artists, especially those who make art to spark hope. Filmmakers like the Daniels have created movies that are about queer joy and about acceptance, with the added important conversation of being in the intersection of identities. Like in Everything Everywhere All at Once, the identities that are clashing are the Chinese American identity and being queer, and how families and support systems are so important and integral to queer joy. And of course, the two non-binary actors who are leading two separate hit shows from HBO, and artists like Lil Nas X, like Sam Smith, like Hayley Kiyoko, Janelle Monáe, and many, many more who brought diversity not only in terms of sexual orientation but also gender identity and race into the Billboard Top 100. From drag queens to gay church choir directors to lesbian stand-up comedians to gay chemists to trans people documenting their transitions to old gay men and lesbians sharing their advice and stories. Despite everything, despite Tennessee's stricter and stricter anti-drag bill, despite Ron DeSantis' Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, queer people have and will always leave their mark in history. No matter how much you try to not acknowledge the LGBTQ community and their effect on the world, they will always be there. They're not going anywhere. They have never cowered. They've been here the whole time. And they will always be here. And the community is standing strong, always and forever. There will always be singing and dancing and art and warmth in the community. Gay doesn't mean happy for nothing. Thank you for watching. I am now going to drink several liters of water. It might not be the best idea to do this while I am not super well, but this was a very fun research project. Fun is not the right word. This was a very interesting research project. If you are tuning in, if you're still watching, thank you so much. I only have one other video like this, my Twilight video. Much less sad, much more angry, but I really hope that I can make more of these videos. It does take a while, and I have other stuff I should ideally do. But if you are watching this, please consider subscribing. Continue the conversation down below if you want. Sources are linked below, and thank you so much for watching. I have nothing else for you.